The long flight home. A son brings his father back after 52 years. On an August morning in 2019, a Southwest Airlines Boeing 737 descended toward Dallas Love Field. To most passengers, it seemed like the end of an ordinary commercial flight. The airplane had traveled from Oakland, California, to Dallas, carrying travelers home to families, jobs, appointments, and everyday life. But in the cargo hold was a flag-draped casket. Inside were the remains of U.S. Air Force Colonel Roy A. Knight, Jr., a pilot who had disappeared during the Vietnam War, more than half a century earlier. And sitting in the captain's seat was his son. Captain Bryan Knight was bringing his father home. 52 years earlier, at this very same airport, Bryan had been a 5-year-old boy watching his father leave for war. Now he was a professional pilot himself, guiding the airplane that would finally return his father to Texas. It was a circle that had taken 52 years to close. The little boy at Love Field. Bryan's last memory of his father began at Dallas Love Field in 1967. His older brother and sister had gone to school that day, so only Bryan and his mother accompanied Roy Knight to the airport. Bryan was 5 years old, and too young to understand what deployment to Southeast Asia really meant. He mainly remembered waiting. At one point, his father handed him 35 cents and told him to go buy something. But the strongest memory came afterward. As Bryan and his mother walked back toward their car, he saw his mother sobbing. For a 5-year-old child, the sight was frightening. He could sense that something was wrong even if he could not understand why. Years later, Bryan remembered a strange heaviness and sadness surrounding that goodbye. His mother's tears foreshadowed what the family could not yet know. Roy Knight would never return from that deployment. A pilot disappears over Laos. Roy Knight had built his life around service. Born in Texas in 1931, he enlisted in the Air Force shortly after his 17th birthday. 5 older brothers had served during World War II. Roy began not as a glamorous fighter pilot, but as a clerk typist, serving in the Philippines, Japan, and Korea. He later attended officer candidate school and became a pilot. By 1967, he was flying the A-1E Skyraider with the 602nd Tactical Fighter Squadron from Udorn Royal Thai Air Base in Thailand. On May 19, 1967, Knight was leading 2 A-1E aircraft on a strike mission over northern Laos when anti-aircraft fire hit his airplane. The aircraft crashed and burst into flames. No parachute was seen. No emergency radio signal was heard. Search and rescue efforts began, but intense hostile fire made an organized search of the crash area impossible. Roy Knight was listed as missing in action. 7 years later, in September 1974, the Air Force declared him dead. For his wife and 3 children, however, missing created a special kind of grief. There was no grave, there was no final goodbye, and for years, there was still the smallest possibility that somehow he might return. Bryan later described what happened when the family first learned his father had been shot down. Their quiet Texas home suddenly filled with people. Everyone was crying. In a single moment, ordinary family life disappeared. From then on, Bryan said, the family's duty was to hope. No matter what you hear, he remembered, you had to have hope. The son follows his father into the sky. There is another remarkable turn in the story. The little boy who lost his father in an airplane grew up wanting to fly airplanes. Bryan's mother understandably resisted the idea. After losing her husband, she told her young son that he would not join the military or the Air Force. But aviation had already captured him. After his first airplane ride, Bryan knew that flying was what he wanted to do. When he became old enough to make his own decisions, he joined the Air Force. Then came an extraordinary connection between father and son. Roy had flown the A-1 Skyraider. Bryan eventually flew the A-10, an aircraft designed for some of the same demanding close air support work performed by the A-1. Bryan even trained for missions similar to those his father had flown, though he never experienced combat. Bryan's own military flying gave him a deeper understanding of his father's world. Looking at one of the last photographs of Roy in the cockpit, he could better appreciate the responsibility and risk that accompanied every mission. The son had followed his father into the sky, but the story was still unfinished. Searching for a man lost in 1967. Decades passed. Then teams from the United States and Laos began investigating a crash site believed to be connected to Knight's disappearance. The search itself became a story of extraordinary patience. Joint American Laotian teams investigated the site in 1991 and 1992. An excavation followed in 1994, when investigators recovered life support equipment. The site was investigated 4 more times in later years. Still, there was no final answer. Then, in January and February 2019, nearly 52 years after Knight vanished, a joint recovery team returned again. This time, they found possible human remains, along with additional life support material. The remains were sent to a Defense POWMIA accounting agency laboratory. Scientists used dental analysis together with material and circumstantial evidence. On June 4, 2019, Colonel Roy A. Knight Jr. was officially accounted for. For Bryan, the news was almost impossible to absorb. He had reached the point where he no longer believed his father would ever be found. The telephone call telling the family that the remains had been positively identified was both wonderful and painful. It gave them an answer they had waited decades to receive, while reopening a loss that had shaped their entire lives. Roy Knight was finally coming home, and his youngest son would fly him there.
Flight 1220. On August 8, 2019, Captain Bryan Knight took command of Southwest Airlines from Oakland to Dallas. His father's flag-draped casket was aboard. Bryan understood what this flight meant to his family. But once he entered the cockpit, he had a pilot's responsibility. His first duty, he later said, was to make the flight uber professional. Southwest regularly carries the remains of American service members, and Bryan wanted this flight handled with the same care, dignity, and professionalism. For the passengers sitting behind him, however, it seemed like any other flight. They did not know the extraordinary story traveling with them. As arrived at Dallas Love Field, that was about to change. A fellow pilot named Mike addressed the passengers. He told them that they had just been part of the honor flight of a fallen American airman from the Vietnam War. He explained that Colonel Roy Knight had left from Love Field in 1967 and had later been shot down over Laos. After 52 years, his remains had finally been identified. Then Mike told them something they could not have expected. Colonel Knight was with them. His casket was in the belly of the airplane. And the captain who had just flown them to Dallas was Roy Knight's son, the same 5-year-old boy who had come to Love Field with his mother to say goodbye to his father 52 years before. Suddenly, this was no longer an ordinary Southwest flight. The passengers had unknowingly accompanied a fallen airman on the final leg of his journey home. Mike's voice grew emotional as he spoke about Bryan. Near the end, his affection broke through the formality of the announcement. "I love this guy," he said. The passengers applauded. Meanwhile, inside Love Field, the story was spreading as well. A gate announcement told waiting travelers about the arriving aircraft and the father and son at the heart of its journey. American flags were handed out, and people began gathering at the terminal windows. The ordinary noise of the airport faded. People stopped what they were doing. Conversations quieted. Airline employees stood waiting. Travelers pressed closer to the glass and looked toward the approaching aircraft. Among them was Canadian journalist Jackson Priscow, who happened to be passing through Love Field after returning from El Paso, where he had covered a mass shooting. At first, he did not understand why people were gathering at the windows. Then he saw the honor guard waiting outside. This was no ordinary arrival. A fallen American airman was coming home. Inside the cockpit, Bryan was still doing what he had done thousands of times before, taxiing a Boeing 737 toward its gate. But as he turned toward Gate 12, he saw something he had not expected. A wall of Southwest employees stood waiting for him. Quietly, reverently. Bryan later said the sight put a lump in his throat. The aircraft stopped. The honor guard approached, and Colonel Knight's flag-draped casket was carefully brought from the airplane. Behind the terminal windows, people watched in silence. Some saluted. Others wiped tears from their faces. Priscow later described an airport that seemed to fall silent, as strangers stood together and watched a man they had never known receive the welcome home that had been delayed for more than half a century. For a few minutes, schedules, boarding calls, and destinations seemed unimportant. There was only the flag-draped casket, the honor guard, and the son who had flown it home. Perhaps the scene touched so many people because its meaning required almost no explanation. A father had gone to war. A little boy had waited for him. 52 years later, that little boy, now a pilot himself, had finally brought his father home. One more journey. 2 days later, on August 10th, Colonel Knight received full military honors near Weatherford, Texas. His family had made an unusual and deeply moving request before the funeral. Over the decades, many Americans had worn POW/MIA bracelets bearing Roy Knight's name, keeping alive the memory of a serviceman they had never met. After his remains were identified, the Knight family asked those who still had the bracelets to send them to the family. The bracelets would be placed inside Roy's casket before burial. After so many years, people who had remembered a stranger could, in a small way, accompany him on the final part of his journey. At the funeral were relatives who had not even been born when Roy Knight disappeared. A military portrait stood beside his coffin. Some mourners placed coins on his headstone as a traditional sign of respect for a fallen serviceman. Time had changed almost everything, but it had not erased him. Roy Knight's homecoming is powerful because it is a story about a father and a son, but it is also part of something much larger. When the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency announced Knight's identification in 2019, it reported that 1,588 Department of Defense personnel from the Vietnam War were still unaccounted for. His own name had long appeared on the corpse of the missing at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. After his identification, a rosette was to be placed beside his name, a small symbol announcing that this missing American had finally been found. And the work continues. Across wars and generations, recovery teams, historians, scientists, forensic specialists, and families continue trying to identify Americans who disappeared in combat. Sometimes a fragment of bone, a piece of equipment, dental evidence, or modern DNA technology can answer a question that has remained open for decades. Each identification is more than a scientific success. Somewhere, a family gets a name back. Somewhere, an empty grave can finally receive the person it was meant to honor. Home. Perhaps that is why the story of Bryan and Roy Knight touched so many people. It contains war and loss, but its deepest subject is something simpler. A promise between the living and the dead, that those who disappear will not simply be forgotten. For more than half a century, Roy Knight had no grave his children could visit. His family grew older. His children built lives of their own. The 5-year-old boy at Love Field became a pilot. Yet somewhere in Laos, the search continued. And one August morning, an ordinary Southwest flight completed a journey that had begun in 1967. As the flag-draped casket was carried from the airplane, and strangers stood silently behind the terminal windows, Bryan Knight had done something few sons could ever imagine doing. The father had left as a pilot. The son brought him back as one. And at last, Colonel Roy A. Knight Jr. was home.
It's time to study new words in context. 1. Deployment. Definition. the act of sending military members to a place to do their duty. Example: Roy said goodbye to his family before his deployment to Southeast Asia. 2. Excavation. Definition: the act of digging in the ground to find something that has been buried. Example: the excavation team searched the crash site for Roy Knight's remains. 3. Circumstantial. Definition: based on facts or signs that suggest something is true, but do not prove it directly. Example: investigators used circumstantial evidence to help identify the missing pilot. 4. Uber professional. Definition: extremely professional, careful, and serious about doing a job correctly. Example: Bryan wanted to be uber professional while flying his father's remains home. 5. Reverently. Definition: in a way that shows deep respect and honor. Example: the Southwest employees stood reverently as the airplane approached the gate. 6. POW. Definition: short for prisoner of war, a military member who is captured by the enemy during a war. Example: many Americans wore POW bracelets to remember soldiers who had been captured during the war. 7. MIA. Definition: short for missing in action, meaning a military member is missing during a war, and it is not known what happened to that person. Example: Roy Knight was listed as MIA after his airplane was shot down over Laos. 8. Rosette. Definition: a small decoration shaped like a flower. In this story, it is placed beside the name of a missing service member to show that the person has been found and identified. Example: a rosette was placed beside Roy Knight's name after his remains were identified. 9. Forensic. Definition: related to using science to find facts about a person, death, or event. Example: forensic experts studied the remains to help determine who they belonged to.
Comprehension questions. 1. Who was Colonel Roy Knight Jr.? Answer: he was a U.S. Air Force pilot who was shot down over Laos during the Vietnam War in 1967. 2. How old was Bryan Knight when he last saw his father at Dallas Love Field? Answer: Bryan was 5 years old. 3. What did Bryan remember most about saying goodbye to his father? Answer: he remembered his mother crying as they walked back to the car after saying goodbye. 4. What happened to Roy Knight on May 19, 1967? Answer: his A-1E aircraft was hit by enemy fire during a mission over Laos. His plane crashed and he was listed as missing in action. 5. Why was Roy Knight's disappearance especially difficult for his family? Answer: his family did not know exactly what had happened to him, and they had no remains to bury or grave to visit. 6. What career did Bryan Knight choose when he grew up? Answer: Bryan became a pilot. He joined the U.S. Air Force and later became a Southwest Airlines captain. 7. What interesting connection was there between Roy's and Bryan's military flying careers? Answer: Roy flew the A-1 Skyraider while Bryan later flew the A-10, which performed some of the same kinds of close air support missions. 8. How were Roy Knight's remains finally found? Answer: American and Laotian teams searched and excavated the crash site several times. In 2019, a recovery team found possible human remains and other materials there. 9. How did experts identify Roy Knight's remains? Answer: they used dental analysis along with material and circumstantial evidence to identify the remains. 10. What was special about Southwest Airlines Flight 1220 on August 8, 2019? Answer: Bryan Knight was the captain, and his father's flag-draped casket was aboard the airplane. Bryan was flying his father's remains home to Dallas. 11. What did the passengers learn after Flight 1220 arrived in Dallas? Answer: a fellow pilot told them that they had been part of an honor flight, carrying a fallen Vietnam War airman. He also told them that their captain was the same little boy who had said goodbye to that airman 52 years earlier. 12. How did people at Dallas Love Field react to Colonel Knight's homecoming? Answer: People became quiet and gathered at the windows. Some saluted, while others cried as they watched the flag-draped casket being removed from the airplane. 13. What did Bryan see as he turned the airplane toward Gate 12? Answer. He saw a large group of Southwest employees standing quietly and respectfully near the gate. The sight gave him a lump in his throat. 14. What did the Knight family ask people to do with POW Mia bracelets bearing Roy Knight's name? Answer. They asked people who still had the bracelets to send them to the family, so the bracelets could be placed inside Roy's casket. 15. Why is Roy and Bryan Knight's story so meaningful? Answer. It is a story of love, loss, patience, remembrance, and finally coming home. A 5-year-old boy said goodbye to his father at Dallas Love Field, and 52 years later, that boy, now a pilot himself, had the honor of flying his father home.